If you've ever dabbled in film as a hobby, especially collecting DVDs, you have certainly heard of the Criterion collection. This is a company known for their Blu-rays and restorations of a wide variety of movies, both mainstream and art house. Recently, the company released a 4K version of Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick's final film and easily one of his greatest works. When footage of this leaked online, however, the reactions were surprisingly divisive. Take a look at these two scenes side by side. On the left you have the 2007 Blu-ray, which most people would be familiar with, and on the right you have the recently released restoration. Notice how the deep blues have been replaced with teals and more realistic lighting. Many saw this and felt betrayed. The original washed out colouring gives Eyes Wide Shut an almost dreamy feel, which harmonises well with the film's plot and dialogue. Why on earth did Criterion decide to completely change the colour grading for their home release then? See, restorations are a lot more complicated than just scanning some film stock and putting it onto a DVD. To first understand what's going on, let's travel back to the year 1996. After decades of Kubrick sitting on the rights to the source material, this is when Eyes Wide Shut finally began principal photography. If you know anything about the director, you would know that he was an obsessive perfectionist. Production lasted 400 days, with shooting alone taking almost a year. It's not an exaggeration to say that Kubrick was involved in every aspect of making the film, which includes colour grading and cinematography. This context is important to understand because the director tragically passed away from a heart attack only 4 months before the film's release. The general consensus is that the final cut of Eyes Wide Shut was complete by this point, with Kubrick showing a screening to the studio a week before his death. Still, conflicting statements call this into question. Longtime collaborator Michael Herr believes that he was unhappy with the product, wishing to make extra fixes to the music, colour and sound. Editor Nigel Galt recounts this differently, insisting that Kubrick was thrilled and only wished to add some extra establishing shots. Regardless, the director was so heavily involved in the production that even if there were some changes made, the final film is Kubrick through and through. Eyes Wide Shut actually received mixed reviews upon its initial release. I bring this up because unless you were one of the few people to watch the film in the cinema back in 1999, then you'll instead be more familiar with the DVDs released after. This is especially the case for millennials and Gen Z, who are either too young or not yet alive to see the movie. The 2007 Blu-ray is therefore the only version most people under 40 will have watched, where night scenes are washed with deep blues. Comparing it to the new Criterion restoration, however, the colour grading is completely different and removes this effect almost entirely. Before we move on, I'd actually like to hear from you. Which one of these two variations of Eyes Wide Shut do you prefer, and why? Let me know down in the comments below, and be sure to double check that you subscribed while you're there too. Anyways, I haven't yet answered why these two look so different from one another, so what's going on then? Restorations aren't as simple as scanning some old film stock and transferring it onto a disc. This is one part of the process, but the amount of work required depends on how well the original camera negative was preserved. After scanning, extensive work is required to fix imperfections in the individual frames, as well as colour grading to match the original. The development process itself is also challenging, as the overall look can vary dramatically depending on the dyes and methods used. Restoration is really more of an art than a science. The specific techniques used depend on what the people involved want to achieve, which is why the 2007 Blu-ray and 4K Criterion versions of Eyes Wide Shut look so different. This is without me mentioning the amount of time and resources required for such a project. Stating all this, it's therefore no surprise that the Blu-ray looks nothing like the original 35mm film print. Here's a comparison of the two side by side. It turns out those washed out deep blues that many associate with Eyes Wide Shut were unintentional. Notice a lack of film grain in the Blu-ray? We don't know the specific methods used for producing this version, however, it was clear that Warner Bros. Sought to remove what they considered to be imperfections. Blu-ray technology was still in its infancy too, meaning we can infer that this release was intended to showcase its ability for high resolution and vibrant colours. When we instead compare the 35mm print to the Criterion restoration, it's clear that this is the more accurate version. I say accurate in this case to mean that the visual style better resembles what cinema goers would have watched back in 1999. This restoration was also overseen by Larry Smith, the original cinematographer of Eyes Wide Shut. His knowledge of Kubrick's intended vision and familiarity with the film development methods used would have been extremely handy in mimicking the intended visual style. Of course, Smith isn't the same person as Kubrick, but I cannot think of anyone else on the planet who is better equipped with the knowledge to tackle such a task. It wasn't a mistake that I put the word ruin in quotation marks in the title of this video. Despite the accuracy of the Criterion release, I've seen comments online claiming that this version is inferior to the 2007 Blu-ray. In fact, don't you find it a bit silly how there can be multiple versions of the same movie in the first place? Up until now, we've been comparing two DVD releases with a scan of some 35mm film print, but there are actually way more than 3 versions of Eyes Wide Shut out there. When we go to the cinema and watch a film, we tend to think that the cut we see is definitive. It has to be. A whole crew spent months or even years making sure that the final product was something that the audience would enjoy. Personally, if I directed a film and had a specific idea of what it should be, I would want that vision to be what people watch. Unfortunately, this is an unrealistic expectation to have. Censorship is firstly the most obvious culprit. Adult-only movies tend to make less money at the box office as not everyone can watch them. Studios will therefore often make changes to the editing or dialogue to get a more accessible classification. Eyes Wide Shut was actually a victim of this. I can't show you due to YouTube guidelines, but the original release actually contained several extra hooded figures that were digitally inserted into the cult's, party scene. Covering up some of the nudity allowed Warner Bros. To get away with an R rating instead of an NC-17 rating in the US. We've seen similar censorship occur around the world, with Florence Pugh's digitally inserted dress in Oppenheimer being a famous recent example. Later DVD releases of Eyes Wide Shut would be uncensored, but this already begins to highlight how many different versions of the movie exist. The format you decide to watch a film in will also dictate which version you see. Take One Battle After Another earlier this year, for example. This movie was shot in VistaVision, and this was the intended way to see it, but there were only 3 theaters worldwide that offered it. 70mm IMAX was another option, but only 10 theaters showed it. There was also standard IMAX, standard 70mm, Dolby, classic DCP, and even 4DX. It's no exaggeration to say that everyone saw something different based on which format they had available to them. I personally watched the film in standard 70mm, then again in regular IMAX, and both were entirely different experiences. Sometimes a director may re-edit their movie for home releases. Blade Runner famously has several different versions floating around, with various changes to which scenes are included and the way they're put together. Would you like to watch the US theatrical cut, the international theatrical cut, the director's cut, or the final cut? Sounds like an annoying decision to make, right? In fact, even if you have the exact same copy of Eyes Wide Shut as someone else, you might have an entirely different experience watching it. Sure, the disc has the exact same information, but the dynamic range of TVs vary based on the model. This doesn't even factor in scratches on a disc, the settings on your TV, and even the lighting of your room. With all this in mind, does it even make sense to have this conversation of which version is superior in the first place? When we talk about which cut of a movie is best, much of the conversation revolves around the director's vision. Look, I get why people love to bring this up. Directors are often the figurehead of their production and have the most influence in dictating what their film is going to be like. If Ryan Coogler is telling you to go watch Sinners in 70mm IMAX, then it would make sense that he had this specific format in mind during principal photography. The subjectivity of art makes this argument hard for me to take at face value though. Here, let me give you an example. David Lynch's 2006 film Inland Empire was originally shot on a Sony camcorder. Given how surreal and weird it is, the digital aesthetic adds to this general vibe. Many were hence extremely disappointed by the 4K restoration released in 2022, which used an AI algorithm to upscale the footage and make it cleaner. What might surprise you, however, is that David Lynch oversaw the restoration himself. In fact, he was thrilled by it. I saw more focus, deeper colors, and it's not like it became a film, but we added grain. The things you can do, it brought it into its own thing. It's really nice looking now. It's really beautiful to me. But who are we to say that David Lynch is wrong? At the end of the day, it's his film that he wrote, shot, edited and directed, so he has the final say in how it looks. Given this, are we even allowed to be disappointed by the upscaling and prefer the original? Of course. If there are multiple versions of the same movie, not everyone is going to agree which is best. Some might have a preference for the cleaner look, but some might prefer the dark and creepy digital look. In the case of Eyes Wide Shut, it doesn't even matter that Stanley Kubrick isn't around to give us his DVD preference. Some might prefer the dreamy deep blues of the 2007 Blu-ray, and others the film grain and teals of the 4K restoration. No version is the correct one, regardless of what the creators have to say about it. We as individuals get to decide what art means to us. That's what makes it art. I want to end this video by bringing up something that's almost never discussed enough in these conversations. The version of a film someone gets to watch often isn't a choice, but based on whatever is available to them. Yes, in an ideal world, everyone could watch one battle after another in VistaVision. But that just isn't possible. There were only 3 theaters in the entire world showing the film in this format, and that's not even factoring in getting a ticket in the first place. Does this mean everyone else who saw one battle after another in a different theater had the wrong experience? DVD releases can also be region-based too, with certain countries having much stricter censorship laws than others. Most people don't even have a DVD player or might not be able to afford one in the first place. Outside of pirating, streaming is the only option for a majority of the population. This is why the question shouldn't be, what's the best version of a film? But rather, how can we make every version of a film as accessible to as many people as possible? It's of course still okay to have preferences for different formats, restorations, and cuts. If you love Eyes Wide Shut and have the means to do so, then definitely compare each release and see which one you like more. However, we shouldn't undermine another person's viewing experience based on which version they decided to watch. Everyone experiences art differently, even those in the same theater as you watching the exact same film. I'm not here to answer which version of Eyes Wide Shut is better, as it all comes down to personal preference. Rather than spend time arguing over the correct way to watch a movie, we should direct our energy into making film more accessible. This isn't me saying you're not allowed to have a preference. I actually welcome you to tell me what yours is. The most important thing is being able to experience and admire Kubrick's masterpiece, regardless of the format. Keep engaging with film, critiquing it, and most importantly, loving it. Be sure to leave me a like if you made it this far, and subscribe for more videos like this one.